So we've just navigated Descartes' rather ambitious ontological proof for God's existence. But let's pause and consider the bedrock of that argument, the very idea of God itself. Is it a coherent concept, or is it just a jumble of incompatible divine properties? Thinkers like Leibniz were quick to point out that before you can prove something exists, you first need to make sure the idea of it makes sense internally. Could talk of God being incomprehensible just be a convenient excuse to sweep logical inconsistencies under the rug? That's the tension we're diving into today. So, what did the critics actually find problematic? Edwin Curley, for instance, argued that Descartes didn't quite nail down how all these divine attributes, omnipotence, omniscience, perfection, and so on, fit together without clashing. He pointed out that Descartes never gave us a clear rule for figuring out how each specific perfection contributes to this overall supreme perfection. And crucially, Curley highlighted that defining God as having all composable perfections is fundamentally weak because it's just too vague. What exactly counts as a composable perfection? It leaves the definition hopelessly indefinite. Then there's Jean-Luc Marion, who took a different angle, suggesting that Descartes was trying to mash together bits and pieces from different theological traditions in a haphazard way, leading to irreducible inconsistencies, basically, a system riddled with contradictions. These aren't small potatoes. They strike at the heart of whether the Cartesian God concept is even logically sound. Now, while I'm not entirely convinced that Descartes can fully dodge these objections, I do believe any serious defense has to grapple with one central, perhaps counterintuitive idea: Descartes' notion of positive incomprehensibility. This isn't just saying we don't understand God, it's saying God's nature positively resists complete comprehension by finite minds. Why is this key? Because it seems to be the linchpin holding together two seemingly contradictory divine attributes: infinity and perfection. How can something be infinitely perfect if we can grasp it perfectly? Descartes uses this very idea to bridge the gap between the general concept of substance or being and the specific, clear, and distinct idea of God as an uncreated, independent thinking thing. It's the mechanism that allows moving from the general to the specific divine concept. Let's compare Descartes' approach to how Spinoza defines God. Spinoza gives us this grand, generative definition. God is an absolutely infinite being, a substance with an infinity of attributes, each expressing an eternal and infinite essence. This sounds like a blueprint, a principle that generates the whole set of divine attributes. You start with the idea of infinite substance, and out pops the infinity of attributes. Descartes, however, offers a much more minimalist definition. God is the substance which we understand to be supremely perfect, and in which we conceive absolutely nothing that implies any defect or limitation. Notice the difference? This isn't a generator, it's more like a sieve. It doesn't build the idea of God, it filters it. It lets through anything that fits our understanding of supreme perfection, and it throws out anything we can conceive of as a flaw or limitation. It's about what we can exclude, not what we can construct. This definition really drives home a crucial distinction Descartes makes: the difference between understanding something and merely conceiving it. Incomprehensibility for him is precisely the inability to be conceived in its entirety. It's the hallmark of the infinite. Think about it. If we could somehow intuitively grasp the single unified essence of God and logically deduce every single attribute from that core, then God would become comprehensible. But if God becomes comprehensible, wouldn't he cease to be God in the sense Descartes intends? The term supremely perfect isn't just about being the best. The adverb supremely points directly to that incomprehensible dimension. And notice how often Descartes pairs infinite and perfect. When talking about God, they seem inseparable in his view. Now, here's another interesting observation. When Descartes lays out his proofs for God's existence, you don't see one attribute dominating the others. There isn't a single master predicate like omnipotence or perfection that serves as the sole foundation. As Curley noted, there's a shift in the third meditation from listing perfections to using a more general formula, but ultimately, no single attribute takes center stage. Why? Because God, in Descartes' view, doesn't have a principal attribute like we do. All divine attributes are equally infinite and perfect. Each one, through its relationship with every other attribute, is identically infinite in its own unique way. There's no hierarchy among them in God's nature. So, if there's no single starting point, how does Descartes avoid the charge that the idea of God is just a vague, indefinite list? The answer lies in a specific methodological move, a kind of lateral reasoning, moving from one divine attribute to another. Interestingly, Descartes himself brought back the term induction around 1648 to describe this process, a term he'd used earlier in the Regulae. In the Regulae, he distinguished between linear deduction, starting from a simple accessible nature, and induction or enumeration, which deals with heterogeneous objects where you can't reduce everything to a chain of intuitions. Guess what? This exact methodology applies to his later metaphysics, especially when constructing the idea of God. Incomprehensibility means we can't intuitively grasp a simple divine nature, so a straightforward deductive chain is impossible. We're not talking about some kind of adequate concept here, where you fully grasp the composition of the divine essence. Descartes clarifies this in his 1648 letter, knowing God intuitively, that direct illumination is fundamentally different from using God himself to make an induction from one attribute to another. So, how does this induction work? Let's take knowledge or intellectus as our starting point. We take our finite experience of knowledge, amplify it, push it towards infinity until it becomes a supreme cogitatio, a thought equal to God's supreme power. Remember, God is the highest object of thought and the supreme thinker, the uncreated, independent substance. This involves two movements. First, amplifying within a category like knowledge from finite to infinite, and second, moving from this amplified category to others. This second movement is the induction we're focusing on. Where do we see this kind of lateral thinking in action? Right here in our own finite experience. Descartes argues that acquiring knowledge allows us to acquire all other goods by the same means. Think about it. When you gain knowledge, you often gain power, clarity, understanding, etc. This human process of gaining everything through knowledge provides a model, albeit imperfect due to the vast difference between finite and infinite, for how God possesses all perfections together. Descartes explicitly states this. As my knowledge increases, I see no reason why I shouldn't be able to use this increased knowledge to acquire all the other perfections of God. Notice the word adipici acquire, not intelliger understand. He even defended this against objections, arguing knowledge provides the means for their attainment. This is a form of induction, mirroring the divine process. This brings us back to Curly's worry about composability. How do we know adding another perfection won't break the whole system? Descartes' answer is that not all categories of being are created equal. Extension, for example, is ruled out because it's divisible. Only thought, cogitatio, is the proper domain for positive infinity and supreme perfection. Being in its most fundamental sense is an intellectual nature. God is the uncreated, independent thinking substance. Now, saying God is a mind doesn't erase the incomprehensible distance, but it identifies the right category. Interestingly, Descartes explores this in his letter on love to Chanute. Love, he says, can bridge vast gaps like between subjects and their queen. Here, incomprehensibility is resolved within thought, through the relationship between two thinking substances, our created soul and the uncreated God. We must consider that God is a mind, and that our soul's nature resembles his sufficiently. Of course, we also need to be careful not to fall into metaphysical error by applying predicates univocally or succumb to the moral failing of pride. So, how do we confirm the consistency of these divine attributes? Not by intuitively grasping a simple divine essence, but by reflecting on our own finite nature as thinking things. God's infinite perfection is like an endpoint for our own striving towards perfection. We experience a kind of unity within ourselves, but it's limited and fragile compared to God's absolute, incomprehensible unity. However, because there's a resemblance between our mind and the divine mind, this internal unity gives us a basis for confidence. When we experience unity among different faculties within ourselves, like the unity between intellect and will when we affirm a truth, or between theoretical knowledge and practical mastery, this provides a representation of God's absolute simplicity. It assures us of the coherence of our idea of God. The unity of the divine predicates is thus warranted by, though not strictly demonstrable from, the unity we experience within ourselves. Let's contrast this with Spinoza again, where thought is one of God's two main attributes. For Descartes, it's precisely the attribute of thought that makes God understandable, despite the incomprehensibility. Could a non-thinking thing be independent? Descartes seems to waver slightly in early letters, but these can likely be reconciled if we assume purely material things cannot be truly causa sui cause of themselves. The key point is this: once we arrive at this thinking, uncreated independent substance, God, our inability to comprehender it doesn't mean we can't understand intelliger it. Incomprehensibility blocks us from mastering the divine idea, prevents us from knowing all its perfections, and stops us from applying predicates univocally. But thanks to the resemblance between man and God, both are thinking beings, we can still gain knowledge, albeit analogical, of the whole infinite, even if we can only grasp it partially. If God weren't a thinking being, the concept of a supremely perfect being would indeed be hopelessly indefinite. So how does this analogy work? Incomprehensibility does create a gap, preventing us from fully grasping even the perfections we know, and forcing us to acknowledge countless unknown ones. It kills any hope of univocity. But because both humans and God are thinking beings, the lack of univocity isn't mere equivocity. The idea of the infinite allows us to know the whole, not just a part, in a way appropriate for a finite mind. We can continue to acquire further knowledge, making the idea more distinct. Once we see how the perfections combine in the unity of the divine mind, the coherence is guaranteed, just like the coherence of a triangle's properties. If God weren't a thinking being, the idea would be indefinite. Knowing God is thus rigorous analogy, balancing resemblance without univocity and difference without equivocity. To wrap up this section, first, Descartes' God is consistently both perfect and infinite. Infinity makes it incomprehensible, perfection makes it intelligible in a positive way. Second, the idea of God isn't just a random list. Its content is built up alongside the proof, guided by an innate idea acting as a filter, not a generator. Third, this filter ensures coherence, preventing the idea from becoming hopelessly indefinite. Fourth, reflecting on our own independence reveals the divine perfections and their unity, establishing the gap through our own finitude. Fifth, we use induction, a lateral move from one attribute to another, mirroring human experience and fitting within his method. Sixth, God has no principal attribute, but thought is ours, creating a crucial resemblance that enables this induction and allows positive understanding despite incomprehensibility. Induction doesn't give us complete knowledge, but it provides a secure foundation. Okay, so we've wrestled with how Descartes constructs the idea of God and navigates the challenges of divine attributes. But now, let's turn the spotlight onto a different, perhaps even more famous puzzle in his philosophy, the Cartesian circle. How does Descartes establish the very rule he relies on to prove things? This leads us to a potential circularity in his argumentation. Remember the truth rule from the third meditation? Whatever I perceive very clearly and distinctly is true. Sounds pretty solid, right? But Descartes immediately follows this with a crucial caveat. Hold on, it's premature to accept this rule yet. Why? Because even those beliefs based on clear and distinct perception, like basic math or geometry, could be doubted. Could a malicious demon or perhaps a deceiving God be messing with my perceptions? To remove this doubt, he embarks on his long journey to prove God's existence and non-deceitfulness. The problem arises when we look at the arguments he uses in the third and fourth meditations to prove the truth rule. Aren't those arguments themselves based on beliefs derived from clear and distinct perception? So, he's using potentially doubtful premises to prove that those same premises are trustworthy. That's the gist of the Cartesian circle. The accusation that his procedure is question-begging. How should we interpret Descartes' goal in proving the truth rule? He says he needs to remove the reason for doubt. There seem to be two main ways to interpret what removing means here. First, the epistemic interpretation. The argument successfully shows there's no good reason to doubt clear and distinct perceptions, or provides a strong reason not to doubt them. Thinkers like Curley and Frankfurt lean towards this view. Second, the psychological interpretation. The argument somehow makes it psychologically impossible for us to doubt those perceptions, or at least helps us reach a state where doubt is impossible. Proponents like Larmor and Rubin champion this. While both interpretations have merit, I think the psychological angle offers a particularly compelling path forward, and it's one that hasn't received as much sustained attention. Let's explore this psychological interpretation. What does Descartes mean by unshakable belief? He talks about conviction based on an argument so strong that it can never be shaken by any stronger argument. He frequently uses terms like firm or solid belief. The key idea seems to be unshakability. The belief cannot be dislodged by argument. Importantly, these passages seem descriptive rather than normative. They describe a psychological state, not necessarily a normative claim about what we ought to do. However, Descartes clearly sees unshakability or firmness as a desirable goal for our beliefs. In fact, he identifies unshakable belief with perfect certainty and with scientia, scientific knowledge. Terms like certain science and true knowledge appear throughout his work, suggesting this psychological characterization of knowledge. Why were Descartes' beliefs initially shaky? It wasn't because he believed a deceiving God existed. Rather, it was the mere supposition, the possibility, that such a God might exist. He had no reason to believe it, didn't even know if God existed. Let's broaden our understanding of supposing to include any mental state like hypothesizing, suspecting, or imagining P. The general form of doubt arises from supposing that our clear and distinct perception faculty is defective. This is the skeptical hypothesis. Holding this skeptical hypothesis as true is the skeptical supposition. Now Descartes links doubt and shakeability. If you lack knowledge of God and the truth rule, you can easily suppose your perception is flawed, and this leads you into doubt. Doubt then acts like a destabilizing force. An unshakable belief, therefore, is one that cannot be destabilized by argument. Now, Descartes insists that clear and distinct perception is psychologically compelling. As long as you perceive something clearly and distinctly, you cannot but believe it. This applies whether it's an intuitive grasp or following a demonstration. Let's call this current clear and distinct perception. But what about when you remember having perceived something clearly and distinctly before, but aren't currently perceiving it? That's recollected clear and distinct perception. Here's the crucial distinction Descartes makes, especially in the fifth meditation. Current perceptions are irresistible, unshakable. Recollected perceptions, however, can be shaken by doubt if you hold the skeptical supposition. Why? Because your belief in a recollected theorem rests on memory, not on the current act of perceiving it. Combining the belief based on past perception with the supposition that your perception faculty is unreliable creates instability. Doubt, by destabilizing belief, can then dislodge the recollected belief. Could we achieve unshakability simply by always staying in the present moment, only believing things we currently perceive clearly and distinctly? Descartes probably wouldn't recommend that. Practically speaking, our minds can't juggle all axioms and theorems simultaneously. So, how does he propose to achieve unshakable belief, especially for those recollected perceptions? In the fifth meditation, he says, "Now, however, I have perceived that God exists, and I have drawn the conclusion that everything which I clearly and distinctly perceive is of necessity true. Accordingly, there are no counterarguments which can be adduced to make me doubt it." Knowledge of the truth rule, secured through the proof of God's existence, provides this unshakability, specifically for recollected clear and distinct perceptions. Why? Because knowing the rule allows you to apply it retroactively to beliefs based on past perceptions. Since current perceptions are already unshakable, this knowledge of the rule secures the rest against the skeptical supposition. This is the key to breaking the circle.